Okay, so we've probably all seen this meme by now, and in today's episode, I want to talk to you about why this meme is far from true, and more specifically, I'm going to talk to you more in depth about what is actually causing all of this inflation that we're seeing, and give you some tips on how to beat the inflation. Let's get into it. All right, so inflation. Let's get started. Inflation is the devaluing of money over time. Now, this could be seen as $1 becoming 90 cents, becoming 80 cents, or it's more commonly depicted as the price of goods increasing while the dollar remains the same overall. A perfect example is $20 in the gas tank will not buy you what it used to only 2 or 3 years ago. And this is due to price increases everywhere because of the inflation that we have going on right now. Now, supposedly, the Federal Reserve tries to keep inflation at a steady 2% over the long haul. However, due to the pandemic and the continuous printing of money, that 2% goal is far from reachable. Currently, the Consumer Price Index, which helps track the price of goods and is a good measure of inflation, the CPI index shows across all spectrums an inflation rate of nearly 6.5%. The two largest categories in the CPI are food and energy. Food weighing in at 5.4% and energy weighing in at a whopping 30%, meaning the price of energy has gone up 30% in the past year. And in the spectrum of energy comes things like gas prices. And while we're talking about gas prices, gasoline of all types is responsible for over 50% of the price increase of the energy sector. But I've covered inflation before in the past, and I've covered all these things before in previous videos. Today's video, I want to talk to you about why that meme is not the case. Why Biden is not to blame for the price of gasoline, food, and everything else skyrocketing around you. Biden is not to blame, and no, neither is Trump. Neither this president or our past president is to blame for this inflation. The person that we need to blame and the person's face that needs to go on this meme is none other than the members of Congress and Jerome Powell. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, how can that really be? And this is because of how our government's banking system is set up. When the government needs money, they go to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve's head honcho is Jerome Powell, and the side of the government that decides to work with Jerome Powell is Congress. Congress and the Federal Reserve work together to create more money. Now, more often than not, they do this by something called quantitative easing. And basically, quantitative easing is when the Federal Reserve creates money, creates currency out of thin air, and then uses that currency to buy investments into the market. Now, typically, it goes into government bonds and big hedge funds. However, this past round of quantitative easing with the pandemic, they went into complete overdrive and basically put money in all sorts of places in the market. They put money in government bonds as they normally do. They put money in hedge funds as they normally do. But then they also went above and beyond and put money into the United States repo market as well as the debt market, that is the bond market. They decided to invest in certain corporate bonds and in a sense bail them out and pay for their debts. Now, the thought behind this was not to increase the M1 money supply. The M1 money supply is the actual money that me and you see day to day. It is actual dollar bills that we can deposit and withdraw from a bank. The thought behind this was not to increase the money supply, thus increasing inflation. It was simply just to inject money into the market in order to prop the market up and stop it from going into a depression. And honestly, this probably would have worked had the government and the Federal Reserve not given billions of dollars to the financial services industry. The Federal Reserve printed billions and billions of dollars worth of money, and the government gave all of that money to the financial services industry, to all the banks. Now, the biggest problem with that is that had the government just given the money to small businesses and individuals, yes, it would have increased the M1 money supply, the money in circulation that me and you experience. Like I said, it would have increased the M1 money supply, but it would have stayed at a relatively low level. Where it got out of hand is that when the money hit the banks not only gave all their executive fat bonuses, but they used the remainder of that money to loan it out to individuals. And if you've watched any of my videos in the past, you'll know that banks can take their deposits, the money you give them, and loan it to 10 to 15 other people, thus turning $1 into $15. Now scale that up by a factor of billions and trillions, and you could really see the extreme level in which I'm talking about today. Now, obviously, an argument can be made that the banks are only doing what their job is to do. Their job is to turn a profit by loaning people's money to other people. But the problem with that is turning $1 billion into $15 billion and then all of that money going to loans. This is why we're experiencing such inflated prices in the housing market, the stock market, and pretty much every other market out there. Because the banks took all the money that the government gave them and then multiplied it by a factor of 15. And then loaned all that money out to all of their consumers. But I should also tell you, for the sake of honesty, that it's not just the banks that are to blame. It's not just Jerome Powell printing hella money and giving it out to everybody. The real issue is pretty much everyone is to blame. Us, the consumers, weren't always spending money wisely, and instead we're taking loans with the lowest possible interest rates and then using them to buy things and consume things. We should have bought them and turned them into assets to make us more money, or to at least go up in value so that we could pay that loan back off earlier. Local governments are also to blame. California is a great example. There are numerous shipping containers in their ports waiting to be offloaded, but California has extremely strict laws and rules regulating truck drivers. They do not like owner-occupied truckers, and they also don't like trucks to be more than a couple years old. This completely limits the available supply of truckers to offload these shipping containers and thus get the supplies to the stores. And finally, the one thing that I think Biden is solely responsible for is shutting down certain gas pipelines in the United States. This, of course, would cause oil and gas prices to go up. But before that pipeline was there, gas prices were one thing. So after that pipeline goes away, gas prices should have returned to what they were prior to that. The fact that they didn't is only to blame to the increase in money supply and the shortages experienced all over the world. But as for what's causing this inflation, I think we've heard enough. Now let's talk about the solution. Let's talk about how we can lower this inflation, or at least stop prices from getting up any higher. And while I don't really want to talk about doom and gloom, the options really aren't all that great. The first option is that the government supports the wealthy and the big business owners, and they keep the interest rates low and keep the stock market inflated with all the extra money. And because of that, prices will only continuously go up until the middle class and lower class are priced out of the market. And I don't mean priced out of the housing market, because that's already happened. And I also don't mean priced out of the stock market. What I mean by priced out of the market is when the cost of goods is so expensive that the lower and middle class can no longer reasonably afford to maintain their cost of living. They won't be able to afford to get to work because gas prices are too high. They won't be able to afford to put food on the table because food prices and grocery prices are too high. Now, history shows us when we can no longer afford fuel and food, there is a giant revolt by the people. Now, this could be peaceful protest, it could be riots, who's really to say? But the people will eventually rise up and start demanding something be done. And then at that point, because everybody wants to be the hero, the government will then step in and say, okay, little guy, I'll help you out. The other option, however, is to increase interest rates. Raising interest rates would hurt the wealthy and the big businesses and would cause the stock market to tumble. However, it would also help the little guys out. With lending money becoming more expensive, less and less businesses and people will borrow that money. Less borrowed money means less money in circulation. And if it costs a lot of money to borrow, then companies are forced to use their profits to research more efficient ways to make or create the same product they've been selling. And once the product can be made more efficiently, it costs cheaper to make, meaning it can also be sold cheaper. If we're able to make the cost of goods go down, then the experienced inflation also goes down with it. So those are the two options on how the government can possibly battle this inflation crisis. But what can you do in your own personal finances that can help you beat this inflation crisis as well? Well, number one is the same thing that everybody will tell you, and that is to diversify all of your investments. Although inflation really sucks for us and our spending, inflation is really good for the market. The more money printed means the more money invested, and the more money invested means the higher stock prices go. So investing your money instead of saving money in an inflationary environment is already a great start. But it's also ill-advised to invest all of your money altogether, even if you're very well diversified. You should have some sort of cash reserves on the side, but the problem is, if you leave cash reserves on the side for an emergency or whatever the case may be, then that cash reserves isn't growing, meaning it's eating away slowly due to inflation. So how do we beat this? Well, like I already said, as far as your investments go, diversify well. As far as your cash reserves go, I recommend you having your cash reserves in a totally different currency, one that's not experiencing the enhanced inflation that the US is. Now, this could be an extremely durable and reliable currency like the euro. They're still experiencing inflation, but it's nowhere near the 6.5% that the US is experiencing. You could also put your money in the British pound, or put some of your money in smaller countries that have very low inflation. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, that's easier said than done, because you can't just go to the bank and ask for a totally different currency. You have to go to an exchange place, and there's kind of a hassle involved. So if you plan on doing that idea, I recommend you opening up something like a PayPal account and just depositing some money there and using that automatically to convert your currency into some other currency. As far as myself goes, I have at least half of my cash reserves in the euro. That way it doesn't experience as much inflation as the US dollar does. And then when I need it, if I do, I will just convert it via PayPal back to US dollars, deposit it into my bank, and then use it. Okay, so we've talked about what caused the inflation, what the options are when it comes to beating this inflation, what you can do personally to beat this inflation. Now let's talk about what I think could possibly happen in the future, meaning what side of the coin and what option is the government going to choose to battle this inflation? Well, if you look at the federal funds rate futures contract, you can see that people are already trading that the future value of the federal funds rate is going to go negative, meaning that people are betting that the federal funds rate, the interest rate that the US primarily uses, is eventually going to go negative. Now, at no point in the history of our economy has the federal funds rate ever gone negative, but just because it hasn't happened in the past doesn't mean it can't happen in the future. We are incredibly over-leveraged as a country, so raising the interest rates would automatically cause a serious market correction, probably even depression. So it is a safe assumption that we could possibly see negative interest rates coming in the federal funds rate pretty soon. And if you're curious how negative interest rates could possibly affect you, then go ahead and click that subscribe button, because in my very next video, that's exactly what I'm going to be teaching you. Hope you got value in this video. If you did, please remember to like and subscribe. If you ever had a question, comment, want something addressed, or even wanted to recommend a topic for a later video, feel free to message me on my dedicated Facebook and Instagram account. Sometimes the comment section can be full of scammers or just trolls, so if you really want a question answered, feel free to message me, as it's private, and I'm on both of those social medias constantly. Either way though, the choice is yours, and I'll see you in the next episode.